very memorable. Roger had a distinguished career as an academic historian before he decided that he would like to do something different. In 1978, he was appointed as the first historian of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which had been created just 3 years earlier in 1975 and quickly recognized the importance of having an agency historian. Unfortunately for Roger, his tour of duty at the NRC was not what he had hoped for, and after a year or so, he decided to return to academe, and Roger's departure from the NRC was a good thing for me. When Roger was at the NRC, he hired an associate who was George Masusan, who some of you might know, you all should know, and George was hired by Roger as associate historian. When Roger left the NRC, George became the chief historian, and he hired me as his associate historian. So in later years, I often thanked Roger profusely for leaving the NRC and making my career at the NRC possible. And in fact, my stay at the NRC, which was much longer and much more pleasant than Roger's was. Well, despite his disappointing experience at the NRC, Roger had been bitten by Potomac fever, and after a brief return to academe, he returned to Washington. He came back in the early 1980s as a deputy historian of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and he moved from there to establish the historical program at what was then called the General Accounting Office, and he spent the rest of his career as historian of GAO. After his return to the government, Roger became a very active member of SHFG. Within a short time, he decided that the Society's bylaws were in need of revision, were in need of improvement. The original bylaws were written by a group of 25 or 30 founding members, and what I remember from that are what seemed like very frequent meetings, and meetings that were endless, where we hatched through the bylaws or the proposed bylaws paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, and seemingly word for word. And what we did was to frame something, to write something that succeeded in establishing this society. So what we did was good. But I can tell you from my experience that the birth of this society was a very painful process. By the mid-1980s, when Roger arrived back in Washington and when he became very active, he correctly discerned that the Society's bylaws were in need of upgrading, and he undertook that job pretty much by himself. About the same time, Roger was nominated to run for president of SHFG, and he must have done a bad job with revising the bylaws because he couldn't find a way to fix the election, which he lost the first time around. But he refused to be discouraged or to diminish his commitment to serving and strengthening the society. Roger was nominated again within a short time, and he served as president of SHFG in 1991. One might think that at that point, Roger would take a rest, but one would be wrong. Roger agreed to serve as a program co-chair for the 1993 meeting. The 1993 meeting was held in his building, and then is now planning and organizing and making arrangements for the annual meeting was a big job, except that in that year, as in previous early years of the society, we held a two-day meeting. And in that year, at least, there was a dinner after the first day. So it was a lot of work and a lot of planning, and I can attest from experience how much work it was because Roger wrote me into being his co-chair. My most vivid memory of that meeting was that one of our members, who apparently was chairman of a session, but he was very unhappy with the room that he was assigned. And I don't know if it was 503 or which room it was, but he complained about it to Roger vociferously and incessantly all day long. He called Roger incompetent, and he just went on and on, hounded Roger all day long about the room that he was assigned. We should have assigned him to the loading dock. I'm not sure which room he was assigned to, but it was totally inappropriate, and Roger was exceedingly angry. And this is a vivid memory for me because Roger was seldom that angry. I mean, he was red-faced angry with good reason. The only other time that I ever saw Roger that angry was on the golf course, where it's also appropriate, of course, and the antics of this member of the society ranked up there with shanking a ball into a water hazard. Well, after that, you might think that Roger was ready for a breather, but no, he was still not finished. He began to float the idea of an SHFG journal, which was met with considerable skepticism, including from the co-chair of the 1993 meeting. But Roger persisted. He played a major role in founding what was then called Occasional Papers, and he edited the first 3 issues. And in those ways, he laid the foundations for the Federal History Journal, which we all benefit from and can take great pride in. And it is in no small measure a tribute to Roger's efforts. As a model for all of us in his commitment to recognizing and publicizing the importance of federal history, I hope you can understand why giving a Roger R. Trask lecture for 2017 is such a special privilege for me, both personally and professionally. Well, my title today, as you've heard, is Why We Write, and I want to reflect on the value of federal history to the agencies for which we work and for the public that we serve. I should make clear that my title does not in any way underestimate or understate the importance of the myriad ways in which federal historians make contributions, including but not limited to research and writing, editing, planning and presenting exhibits, preserving and making available federal records, answering questions from the staff and the public, responding to media inquiries, giving talks to agency staff members and to public audiences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In approaching the topic of the value of federal history, I'm returning to a topic that my good friend Ray Smock addressed as a Trask lecture a few years ago, and I want to build on Ray's insights because the topic is so vitally important, especially at a time when facts and reflection on the meaning of those facts are not exactly held in the highest regard at the highest levels of the federal government. And I will draw largely from my experiences and observations as historian with the NRC for more than 30 years. The critical question that we need to answer and that we need to keep answering over and over is, what is the value of what we do in all those functions and duties we perform as federal historians? Why do agencies hire us and pay us for the work we do as professional historians? Well, at least in my experience, we don't get a lot of help in answering this question from the historical profession or from our academic colleagues. It is my theory, and I must confess this is not based on empirical research, but from my own impressions through the years, that academic historians, many academic historians, and I can't quantify it, many academic historians have asked, what is the practical value of history? What good is history? And why do federal historians, or why do federal agencies hire historians to serve on their staff? And I think if you ask about the value of history to many of those who have never had to explain it or to justify what they do, you get answers like, oh, it explains the human condition, or it helps to preserve American democracy, or something true enough. I mean, there are lots of good reasons to study history, true enough, but it doesn't explain why agencies hire historians. What is the practical value of what we do for the agencies that pay us a salary? And that's the question that we need to address. And even though I haven't done any empirical research on this, I do have an experience which I think supports my opinion or my bias. A few years ago, I gave a lecture at the University of Maryland, and I talked about why the NRC paid me for 30 years to write history and what I thought the reasons were that the NRC did that. And after I gave my lecture, and it was attended by some of my colleagues here, by graduate students, by students, and by a few faculty members. And one of the senior faculty members raised his hand and said, would you be willing to talk to the president of the University of Maryland? well, you know, what's that all about? It wasn't until later that I found out that the president of the University of Maryland wanted to abolish the golf course, so I would have been happy to have talked to him about that. But what the faculty member was suggesting was that I speak to the president of the University of Maryland about the practical value of history. Apparently, and I never knew the details, but apparently the history department had been losing slots to computer science departments, to STEM programs, and you all know how this goes. And so he thought if I could talk to the president that maybe I could explain to him the practical value of history. And I said, well, sure, I'd be willing, and it never happened. But what struck me was that why couldn't the history department do that? You know, why couldn't the history department make an appointment with the president and talk to him about the practical value of history? And I don't know the answer, but my guess is they didn't have anyone, or at least this one faculty member thought they didn't have anyone who could do that. And I don't mean to pick on my alma mater. This same pattern, I'm sure, could be repeated in colleges and universities across the nation. And one of the great failures of the history profession is its failure to recognize and to publicize and to make clear to those who are not historians the practical value of what we do. Of course, also in my experience, many academic historians find the answer to the question of why agencies hire historians to be simple and obvious. They are convinced that agencies hire historians for the primary, if not the sole purpose, of making the agency look good. I can't count the number of times that I went to professional meetings and I was asked by people about whatever book or project I was working on. Now, is this your own work? And the assumption behind that question is obvious, and it's astonishing. Because the assumption is that my work and your work for your agencies is being influenced in a bad way, or perhaps dictated by the agency for which you work. And I know in all cases, or at least most cases, this is certainly not the case. And it reflects an attitude which is still held. I mean, we're now in a fifth decade of a job crisis. You all know about that. But in spite of that, there are still too many academic historians who feel as if anyone who is not an academic historian, and certainly anyone who is a government historian, is inherently dishonest. And this attitude, of course, is summarized in the epithet court history. Those who are guilty of this misconception apparently fail to recognize the importance of accurate, sound historical knowledge for government agencies and for other institutions. And in that way, the scholars who continue to harbor this kind of attitude undervalue the importance of their own profession. One grassroots professional group that calls itself History Relevance does much better. It has recently taken a stab at the question of the value of history, and the reasons that it cites have won the endorsement of the Organization of American Historians and other professional groups. It has published a statement that lists 7 ways in which the study of history is essential. They include nurturing personal identity, teaching critical skills, building strong communities, encouraging economic development, providing role models and inspiration for leaders, preserving democracy, and crafting better solutions to current problems. I think that all those reasons are valid. There are lots of good reasons to study history, but the one that best explains why agencies value history, and the one that we need to emphasize and continuously re-emphasize, is the one I mentioned last, providing historical background on issues of current concern and ongoing interest to the agency, to the agencies for which we work. From my experience at the NRC and my conversations with federal historians through the years, I am convinced that agencies hire historians for the immensely practical reason that careful, honest, and sound history provides unique and invaluable insights that other professionals do not provide. We have things to offer that nobody else does or can offer. Historians explain the reasons behind decisions, actions, and procedures, along with, and this is essential, the historical context that is enormously and uniquely useful in understanding what is going on in the present. And I realize that I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think these points are so important that they cannot be overstated. Good history is essential for making informed and we hope wise policy decisions, though as historians, of course, we cannot guarantee a good outcome for the information we provide. Perhaps the most important thing that I learned in my 30 years at the NRC is that people outside of the history profession value the information and the insights that history provides. For most of my career at the NRC, I was the one and only historian. George Masusan left the NRC in 1986. He and I worked together for 7 years. George left to become historian of the National Science Foundation in 1986, and then I became the sole historian until we hired my replacement just a few months before I left. So between 1986 and 2010, I was the only historian at the NRC. And I was always impressed and at first a little surprised at how much scientists, engineers, lawyers, and other professionals appreciated history, appreciated good, sound history. At least I hope that's what I provided. They did not care about historiographical issues. They did not care about debates among historians on controversial issues, but they did care deeply about the historical background of the issues with which they dealt on a day-to-day basis, because it helped them to better understand those issues. The best example of how the NRC valued my work as agency historian was a response to my book on the 3 Mile Island accident, which was then and still remains the most important single event in the history of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The book was published under a catchy title, 3 Mile Island, by the University of California Press in 2004, and not by accident just before the 25th anniversary of the accident. 3 Mile Island was not exactly a glorious moment, to put it mildly, in the history of the NRC. The fact that the accident occurred should never have happened, and everyone at the agency knew that. But what most people at the agency by 2004, 25 years after the accident, didn't know was much about what had happened, what caused the accident, the response to the accident, the consequences of the accident, and that's what I tried to do in my book. By 2004, a lot of people who worked at the NRC had come since 3 Mile Island occurred. They knew that something not good had happened at 3 Mile Island, but they didn't know much about it, so they were happy to learn about the most important event in the agency's history. And more to my surprise, a number of